Hey everybody, welcome back to Jägerhorn. I've had some fun with Reshade, and I'll link a tutorial in the description made by Variable Gaming on how to get it to work, but basically it allows you to do all kinds of post effects in-game, so all of the shots that you're looking at right now have some ambient occlusion and depth of field effects, as well as just general nice looking stuff like ambient lighting and things like that attached to them. So yeah, that's why the game looks really different than normal and why the autofocus is being a bit weird as the train just passed by right there. But yeah, I've been super excited about this, primarily because I want to use this in Volvara, but you'll see more of that later on. But yeah, I've just had some fun going around the map of Jägerhorn and trying out all of the effects, and I think it just works really well on this map. Anyway, let's get started on the build of today, and very quickly there, I actually kind of accidentally showed in the time-lapse some pre-built stuff that I had, just kind of measuring out what I wanted to build here, and usually I don't really show that stuff, but I figured I might as well leave that in there. Basically, before I build, I very often just build out just kind of draw out the shape of what I want to build in very basic pieces, so that I have an idea of what things are going to look like, just to, you know, make sense of size and shapes and composition of everything before I get into the actual detailing. That said, the actual detailing of the building is what I'll be getting into for the rest of this episode, and yes, it'll only be one building. I was hoping to maybe do a little bit more than this, but by the time I was done with this, I already figured I had enough footage to just make one episode out of it. So that's that. I'll get to the surrounding area in the next episode, most likely. So what I wanted to build is something that I've been struggling with for a long time. This piece of land has been demarcated as a part of the park to build a building on for a really long time. I just really couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with this. I wanted to turn it into a restaurant or some kind of food service, but I really couldn't figure out how to fit it into the rest of the park, so I've been procrastinating on this for pretty much the entire duration of the build, which is over a year already, I'm ashamed to admit. So I finally decided that it was time to get to this piece of land, and before I did, I just kind of redid some of the path layouts, because I think this works out a little bit better, just being one simple small building. And yeah, this building itself is really going to sort of be the weenie of this area, the main drawer of attention, even though it's not going to draw that much attention to it. And something that I think should close off this part of the park quite neatly. Now, my inspiration came not from the Alps this time around, but actually from London. There's this really interesting villa called the Chalet estate in London, right next to the Thames. Actually, I should say the Thames, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, all of you Londoners. I always revert back to what I originally kind of thought it was. Anyway, yeah, it's this really cool estate which has an old Swiss chalet on it, which supposedly was imported from Switzerland in the 19th century and put into London as a boathouse. And a few years ago, some architect decided to pick this up as it was kind of more or less abandoned and turned it into what it is right now, which is quite a villa with some extra floors, as far as I know. And the result is this really interesting build, which is a very clear small Swiss chalet, but placed on almost a pedestal of multiple different floors underneath it. Now, the villa in real life would cost you something like £10 million or upwards of that. Extremely expensive, so definitely not much of an idea to emulate for a theme park, I suppose, but on a smaller scale and with less floors, I thought it would be nice to build something very similar. Just to get something which looks unique and sets itself apart from the rest of the buildings in the park enough to kind of seem like its own little weenie. Very much like the station building or the church building on top of the rock do. Because I do want to have some more traditional, simple, rustic buildings next to this. But I really wanted this building itself to draw some attention to it and to kind of stand out, while at the same time having the same general theme as the buildings around it. And that villa being, you know, a traditional, original Swiss chalet, but on steroids basically, served as a good inspiration for that. And I really like the idea of having multiple floors as well, even though it almost starts looking like an Asian pagoda in a sense. The villa that I'm talking about has 4 floors, one of them being the bottom floor, which is a little bit larger than the other ones, but the other ones are pretty much just stacked floors like a Japanese pagoda, which is really interesting to see. So I'm gonna go with 1 floor less, just to make the whole building a little bit smaller and more likely to be built in a theme park. I also think it just works a bit better, because if this building were really big, it would just kind of make it too obvious that the mountain, quote unquote, that the coaster itself is based on is really small. And I should also add, of course, I'm adding quite a bit of forced perspective in this building. So this shape, I think, lends itself really well to having forced perspective, because the second floor is already kind of set back from the ground floor, and then the top floor with the roof over it, which I'm going to work on in a little bit, is going to be even smaller and even shorter. So even though all of the floors kind of look as if they are realistic and all about the same size, the top floor is getting really small and quite cramped, which works really well for the forced perspective, I think. This building overall really looks like it is a proper 3-floor building, even though in terms of height it's about 2 and a little bit. Now, most of it so far, and I'm sorry that I didn't talk much about the detailing, I probably should have done that, but this building just kind of required a long intro, I suppose. The rest of the detailing is very similar to what I based it on in real life, which is almost a little bit too copied for my liking. I always like to make the buildings that I come up with, you know, even if they're inspired by real life buildings, a bit more unique than that. But in this case, I figured I might as well just take it this way, because it's pretty much a winning team that I don't want to change too much. Some of the biggest changes include just taking a floor out of it, doing different detailing elements, because obviously we have different pieces in Planet Coaster than in real life, and I really wanted to make use of that and just come up with new details. And the ground floor is actually asymmetrical, which is different from the one in real life as well. I just like it this way because I like asymmetry, and I think it fits a little bit better in this context to sort of have an overhang on the side of the coaster and on the side of this really small valley that it's situated at, but not have the same kind of overhang on the side of the path on the right here. I just thought that worked out a little bit better composition-wise. And then some of the other details are a bit different as well, I suppose. In real life, the villa has a lot of glass on the outside. It's really quite modernized. So this one just has more wood, and while it does have some glass, especially on these sections here in the middle, it's not quite as much as the real life counterpart. But yeah, altogether I think it just works too well to try and come up with anything else to complicate it too much. And really, if you take away the ground floor of this build, if you just look at the top 2 floors, it is pretty much just a simple traditional style Swiss chalet. All that really makes it different is that it's built on top of this extra ground floor, which I think just works really well in this context. So yeah, here's the top floor where, as you can see, especially on the supports of the roofs on the sides, this floor doesn't really actually make much sense. It's very small and it's very, very low, but from a force perspective sense, I think it works quite well. And then for some of the other roof decorations, I'm just getting back to the style which I have in the rest of the build, the Swiss chalet style inspired gable decorations and wooden supports that support the roof. I just really love that kind of detailing underneath these roof structures of these buildings, which when I'm referring to Swiss chalet style in that case, I'm referring to the architectural style and not to the building itself being a Swiss chalet. So that's pretty much it for the building itself. So besides that, I wanted to have just a small terrace underneath this overhang here. to put some picnic tables and umbrellas and things like that to make it look a little bit more inviting. There's not too much to this, to be honest. Just a quick, simple fence over here to demarcate that and make sure that people aren't going to run onto the coaster track. And that's really just about it. I also need to get back into some of the other sections of the park here and add some elements in which we didn't have before, but I think work out really well. And one of those is just the planters. The extra planters that we've gotten in some of the latest updates are just so good. Especially the empty ones, like the larger bowls that I just placed, which are just great because you can put your own flowers in them, which, you know, adds a whole nother layer of customization. But just because they're so large and you can put them anywhere as extra decoration to get some color into the build, I think it works out really well. This whole build in general, it's all very rustic and just uses a lot of grey and brownish colors and not too much variation in terms of textures, because that's just realistically what the theme would be like. So having flowers there is just one of the few ways in which you can actually add some color in this. Not to mention that I think, given the theme, it's also quite a must to have lots of flowers everywhere for that sort of summer alpine theme. Now for the inside, you might know that I am terrible at indoor decorations, so I'm just putting some simple stalls there, some simple counters with very basic decorations, but that's really just about it. This is where the different placements of the glass sections of the building worked out really well though, because in the middle there are just wooden panels on the sides of the building, so in those wooden panels I could hide these shops. Might get back into this later to give it some more decoration. I don't know what it is, but I just don't really like doing interiors, so I just like to keep them really simple and just get it over with. But one day I should probably actually properly do some interiors, because throughout all of the parks that I've done, I've never really delved into interiors much, and this is not going to be the exception. At least it's gonna be decently functional, and it's gonna be another place for guests to actually get food. Because so far, I think the only actual food places are all in the quote-unquote main streets area of the park, with the little fry shop and a few stalls in some of the buildings kind of hidden on the sides of the park. And I guess there's the gift shop also next to the coaster itself. And in fact, the rest of this episode now is just going to revolve around foliage, because I'll be adding so much foliage around this building and even on the different floors of this building, which can always feel very cheap. I've said many times at this point, I think, how foliage is often for architecture just a way to try to fix up bad architecture or make it look good somehow, which always kind of works. If you're not happy with the building, just throw some foliage around it and eventually it's gonna end up looking pretty good. But in this case, it just fits the theme too well, so please excuse me here if I'm putting lots of flowers and everything around this building. Or flowers that are really just kind of acting as bushes, because still one of my favorite things is just that we have these flowers that we can recolor, make green, and just use as bushes instead. Which is something that I haven't done too much throughout Jägerhorn, because for the majority of the build they weren't in the game yet, but I definitely also want to get back into some of the older parts and add some of those extra bushes in, just because I want all of the foliage in this park to look quite dark and alpine-like, and there was only a very limited amount of foliage we had when I started this that sort of fit those descriptions, but there's a lot more of it now. And then of course also here on what are pretty much the balconies of this building, lots of red flowers, because that's what you typically tend to see on these kinds of buildings. It just gets the whole vibe of this theme across best, I think. And for the rest, I'm just filling it up with a lot of clutter, because that works out quite well to fill up empty spaces. Just one of those very theme park-ish things, I feel. And one of the reasons why, in general, you know, whenever I get the question of whether I'm related to architecture in any way, I always kind of chuckle at that, because architecture in theme parks is just such a completely different thing from architecture in real life. And then again, real life theme parks and designing real life theme parks is a completely different thing from just playing a simulation game as well. So yeah, really, I think I'm okay doing all of this stuff just because we're in a theme park game here, which is very different from the real world of architecture. And finally, just dressing up this area a little bit, because I had to remove some of the trees to actually keep the view of the building, because I wasn't thinking of how the building was going to be, but given that the building is quite small, I want to have very few trees around it to not try to dwarf the building itself too much and allow the building to seem a little bit bigger than it actually is. And yeah, that's basically it for this episode. So I hope you guys enjoyed the sort of comeback of Jägerhorn. For now, I do want to get the next episode in much quicker than the last time. But yeah, I have to say, I was very unmotivated and uninspired for this project for a while, and then it's just really hard to get working on stuff. But with this build, I've sort of regained some of my inspiration there, so hopefully I should be on a good track again. Anyway, I'll see you guys next episode.